You can't blame Nelson Mandela for not knowing what all these dynamics were. And remember, he was sitting in prison, even at Victor Verster. The ANC leadership in exile couldn't yet enter the country, engage with him. The people who were able and allowed, and I think deliberately allowed to do so, by the apartheid regime to go and talk to him there at the house at Victor Verster prison, where he was kept for the last part of his imprisonment, were exactly these guys from the cabal. If you look at who were allowed to go and visit Nelson Mandela in prison at Victor Verster, it was Cyril Ramaphosa, it was Murphy Murobe, it was Praveen Gordhan. Those who are fingered in that report that I've referred to earlier as being part of that cabal. So there you find President Nelson Mandela is coming out of prison. He's suddenly released. Who is there to meet him at the gates of Victor Verster? Cyril Ramaphosa. Here's the first one to shake his hand. Here's the one who gets into the car with him. Here's the one who goes with him to the parade in Cape Town, at the City Hall in Cape Town, stand on that balcony and actually hold the mic for him to speak. They immediately insert themselves right there. The dynamics were very difficult. You must also not forget that there were other influences coming to play on President Nelson Mandela. There were people who were coming to the fore from white monopoly capitalism in South Africa, amongst them the Menels, Clive and Irene Menel, the owners of the second largest mining enterprise in South Africa, Angloval, who would say to Mandela, we will give money to the ANC. We will assist you and others to be able to resettle yourselves in South Africa because you come out of prison, you've got no money. Those who come from exile, they've got no money. We will give you money. We will help you. We forget that it was the Menels who paid the education for President Nelson Mandela's two daughters, Zenani and Zinzi Mandela, to go to school. It was the Menels who helped to sustain President Mandela's family while he was in prison. These people had a long-term plan. They knew that those monies which they invested in assisting these families was an investment on having influence and control over these comrades in the future once the negotiations would start. And it played out exactly like that. We know that the Menels were central in suggesting to President Mandela that Cyril Ramaphosa should be brought into the senior leadership of the ANC. In fact, it was them who said to President Mandela, we think Cyril Ramaphosa will be a good Secretary General of the ANC. And President Mandela, having listened to them, having met Cyril Ramaphosa as soon as he came out of prison, one of the first people he engaged with, he pushed him to become in 1991 at the first legal conference of the ANC in June 1991 in Durban, for Ramaphosa to become the Secretary General of the ANC. It was an anomaly. Ramaphosa was a Johnny-come-lately. He was not even part of the senior leadership of the ANC, but yet he was parachuted in, also through the power and influence that Mandela so amply had, pushed him to the fore for Ramaphosa to become the Secretary General of the ANC. And once he was Secretary General of the ANC, he then started to extend his control over the National Executive Committee of the ANC. He then started to bring his own people in to be part of the various committees of the ANC. Remember, the negotiations started with Thabo Mbeki as being the chief negotiator, and Jacob Zuma being the head of intelligence. When both Jacob Zuma and Thabo Mbeki were outside the country, actually traveling with President Nelson Mandela, Ramaphosa called a meeting of the National Executive. He used those friends and cronies of his who he had brought into the NEC to pull off a coup, They removed Thabo Mbeki as the chief negotiator for the CODESA negotiations. They removed Jacob Zuma as the head of intelligence. And Ramaphosa imposed himself as the head of negotiations from hence on. That was always the plan. And that plan unfolded beautifully for them once he managed to pull off that coup in the National Executive Committee of the ANC. And then he formed a very, very close, insidious relationship with the chief negotiator of the National Party, Rolf Meyer. And between the two of them, they made the secret deals, they made the arrangements behind the scenes, and then they came and presented those deals, those arrangements in the public domain of CODESA. They manipulated the situation, and eventually we ended up with this deeply flawed constitution that we have today, with a negotiating process that granted the sunset clauses, which meant that the white apartheid apparatchiks, those who were part of the government of the old apartheid regime, had their jobs secured. That is what the sunset clauses meant. It also included in the Constitution a clause that gave property rights, guaranteed property rights. Now, how on earth do you guarantee property rights in a country where you know the colonial history of this country is that white colonists came to South Africa and stole the land from the indigenous people? But you go and introduce a property rights clause in the Constitution that now cements, secures those stolen properties as a right for those white colonists. And that is the kind of sellout project that I keep on talking about. And interestingly enough, today, after all these years, that relationship between Cyril Ramaphosa and Rolf Meyer still continues. And Rolf Meyer today has been appointed by Cyril Ramaphosa as one of his special advisors to the President of South Africa. Can you imagine someone who was an apartheid agent, who at one stage was the Minister of Defense under the apartheid regime, who was part of the apartheid regime's State Security Council that took decisions to attack the ANC in the neighboring countries in Southern Africa, who was part of those decisions to fight the wars in Angola, to fight the ANC in Lusaka and attack the ANC in Lusaka, in Lesotho and in Botswana. That same man, that same apartheid apparatchik who was part of the crime against humanity, has been made by this president, Cyril Ramaphosa, his special advisor. It cannot get worse than that. Okay.